the number 33. Most people hear it and think they know what it means. They've heard it their whole lives, in churches, in classrooms, in passing conversations, where someone mentions the age Jesus was when he died. And they nod, and they move on, and they never really stop to sit with it. I understand that. There's something about a number that feels settled, finished, like it belongs in a footnote, and not in the middle of a living question. But I've been sitting with this one for a long time, and what I've found is that 33 is not settled at all. It's alive. And once you start pulling the thread, you realize it runs all the way back to the beginning. Not just the beginning of a ministry or the beginning of a story, but the beginning of everything the Hebrew Scriptures were building toward across 1,000 years and more. Let me start with something concrete, something you can picture. Imagine a hillside outside Jerusalem, dry and pale in the morning, the kind of light that makes stone look almost white. The year is somewhere around 30 CE, give or take a few years depending on which scholar you ask. And that's an honest caveat worth keeping. A man is being taken to that hillside to die. He's 33 years old. And here's the thing that doesn't get talked about enough. That age, that specific number, is not an accident. It's not a biographical footnote. It's a coordinate. And like any coordinate, it only makes sense when you know the map it belongs to. The question most people bring to this is the obvious one. Why 33? Why not 35 or 40, which in the Hebrew tradition carried enormous symbolic weight as the number of testing and formation? Why not 30, which was actually the age at which Jewish men formally entered public life, the age at which a Levite could begin his full duties in the temple, according to Numbers chapter 4? There are real answers to those questions, and we're going to walk through them. But the real answer is bigger than any single explanation. It's woven, and weaving takes time to see. So stay with me here, because we're going to have to go back. A long way back. Back before the crucifixion. Back before the ministry. Back before Bethlehem. Back to a moment in the Hebrew calendar that most people have forgotten, or maybe never knew was connected to this at all. Back to a king, and a city, and a number that shows up in a very specific set of places in the text, always marking the same kind of moment. A moment when something that had been promised finally arrives. David was 30 years old when he became king. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 4. 30 years. And then the text says something interesting. It says he reigned 40 years in total, which gives you a reign that ends at 70. But the number that catches me is what happens between 30 and 33. Because the text also tells us that David reigned over Judah and Hebron for 7 years and 6 months. And then he reigned over all Israel and Judah in Jerusalem for 33 years. Look at that, 33 years in Jerusalem, the city of God. The city where the temple would one day stand. The city where, generations later, another man would die on a hill just outside the walls. David reigned 33 years in Jerusalem, and when you start pulling that thread, you start to find it everywhere. But before we follow it, let's sit for a moment in what 33 actually meant in the ancient world. Numbers were not neutral in the Hebrew tradition. They never have been, not in any ancient tradition worth its salt, but especially not here. The Hebrews carried number as meaning the way we carry language. 7 was completeness, wholeness, the signature of the divine creative act. 40 was testing, wilderness, the long wait before arrival. 12 was the covenant people, the tribes, the apostles. And 33? 33 sits at the intersection of 2 of those. It's 3 times 11. It's 30 plus 3. And 3, in the Hebrew mind, was the number of divine confirmation, the pattern that said, this is real, this is established, this is not coincidence. when Abraham received the 3 visitors at Mamre, when Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish, when the temple was completed on the 3rd day in Ezra's account, when Jesus spent 3 days in the tomb. The pattern of 3 was always the seal of divine action. Something done once is an event. Something done 3 times is a testimony. And 33 carries that 3 like a hidden signature, the 30 of human preparation and the 3 of divine confirmation, joined in a single number that appears at some of the most pivotal arrivals in the whole of Scripture. I want to be careful here. The way any honest reading of these texts has to be careful. The tradition of attaching meaning to biblical numbers is ancient and deep, and it stretches from the rabbinical schools through the early church fathers, but it's also a territory where people have gotten carried away, where patterns get forced and connections get invented. So I'm going to walk you through what the text actually says, what the historical record actually supports, and where the interpretive tradition goes further. And I'll try to be clear about which is which as we go. What the text says without any interpretive pressure at all is this. Jesus was baptized at approximately 30 years of age. Luke says so explicitly in chapter 3, verse 23, and his ministry lasted somewhere between 1 and 3 years before his crucifixion. The 3-year estimate is the one most scholars lean toward, and here's why. The Gospel of John records 3 separate Passover feasts during the public ministry of Jesus. John chapter 2, John chapter 6, John chapter 11, each one marking a year's passage. 3 Passovers, 3 years, starting at 30, ending at 33. And each of those Passovers is not just a calendar marker. Each one advances the arc of what Jesus is doing and saying in a way that the text seems to have constructed deliberately. The first Passover gives you the cleansing of the temple, the declaration that this body is the new temple. The second gives you the feeding of the 5,000 and the bread of life discourse, the unmistakable echo of manna in the wilderness. And the third gives you the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, the moment the Passover lamb is slain. 3 years, 3 Passovers. The arc lands at 33. Now here's where the history gets interesting, because the crucifixion of Jesus doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens at a very specific moment in the Roman occupation of Judea, under a very specific prefect, Pontius Pilate, whose tenure we can actually date from sources outside the New Testament, specifically from the Jewish historian Josephus and from the Roman historian Tacitus. Pilate was prefect of Judea from roughly 26 CE to 36 CE. Jesus' crucifixion falls within that window. Most historians, both religious and secular, who've worked seriously with the dating evidence, land somewhere around 30 CE or 33 CE for the crucifixion, with 33 CE actually gaining ground in recent scholarship based on astronomical calculations of Passover dates in that era. The Friday Passover of 33 CE is one that the astronomical record supports, and it aligns with the Johannine chronology of Jesus dying on the day of preparation, the day the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. I'm not here to settle the debate of scholars on this, because honest scholars disagree, and the evidence allows for more than one reading. But what I can say is that the historical and astronomical data doesn't contradict the age of 33. It fits, and that fitting matters because this isn't just a number someone chose for symbolic reasons and then attached to a story. The story itself, when examined seriously, lands a person at that age through the biographical evidence we have, which means we're not dealing with mythology. We're dealing with history that happened to land on a number that resonates through the whole of Scripture. That's a different kind of thing. That's not someone writing a number into a legend. That's someone looking back at what actually happened and recognizing that the coordinate fits the map. Let's go back to David for a moment, because I don't think we've stayed there long enough. 2 Samuel chapter 5 is worth sitting with in its original Hebrew if you can, because the text does something precise when it names the number 33. The Hebrew word for Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, appears in that same chapter in a context that connects the city, the covenant, and the king in one movement. David captures Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and the text says he took up residence in the stronghold and called it the City of David, and he built the city around it, and then it marks his reign. 33 years in that city. The rabbinical tradition has long noticed that the numerical value of the Hebrew letters in certain divine names adds up in patterns that include this number. And while gematria, that's the Hebrew system of assigning numerical value to letters, while gematria can be overused and made to say almost anything, the connection the tradition draws here is not invented. The number 33 in the context of David's reign in Jerusalem marks the full arc of a king who was called, who stumbled, who was broken and restored, and who ended his reign still holding the city that God had chosen. That's an arc, and arcs repeat in Scripture. They're supposed to. The whole structure of the Hebrew Bible is built on typology, the idea that earlier events and figures prefigure later ones, not because the later ones are just copies, but because the same God is working the same kind of redemption through different hands and different times, and the patterns reveal that. Moses prefigures a deliverer. The Passover lamb prefigures a sacrifice. The tabernacle in the wilderness prefigures a dwelling of God among people. And David, the shepherd king, the anointed one, the one who was both beloved and broken, he prefigures something too. The Hebrew word for anointed one is Mashiach, which comes into Greek as Christos, which comes into English as Christ. David was an anointed one. Jesus was called the Anointed One, and both of them were connected to the number 33 in the city of Jerusalem. The text is not shy about this connection. The New Testament writers, writing as Jews who knew their scriptures cold, drew the David-Jesus line explicitly and repeatedly. Matthew begins his entire gospel with a genealogy that runs through David. Acts chapter 2 has Peter standing in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost and saying directly that David was a prophet, and that what happened to Jesus was what David had seen in advance. The connection is built into the structure of both testaments. The 33 is part of that structure. But I want to take you somewhere else now, somewhere that surprises people when they first see it, because the 33 doesn't just show up in the context of David's reign. It shows up in a form that takes a little unpacking, in the very structure of the covenant promise to Abraham. And when you see it there, the whole thing opens up in a way that's hard to forget. Genesis chapter 17. Abraham is 99 years old when God appears to him and establishes the covenant of circumcision. That's the text. What's less often noticed is what comes just before in Genesis chapter 12, and what the span of years looks like when you map it. Abraham is 75 years old when he leaves Haran in response to the divine call. He arrives in Canaan. He receives the first promise of land and descendants, and then 24 years pass, years of wandering and waiting and stumbling in grace, before the covenant of circumcision in chapter 17. But here's what the rabbinical tradition has preserved, and what careful readers of the text have noticed. There is a strand of thought in Jewish interpretation that sees the full arc of Abraham's covenant relationship, from the call to the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22, as a span that includes the number 33 in a specific way. Isaac, the child of promise, the son who was born when Abraham was 100 years old, was 33 years old, according to a significant strand of rabbinic tradition, when Abraham was commanded to offer him on the mountain. That's not in the text explicitly, The text doesn't give Isaac's age at the Akedah. That's the Hebrew word for the binding. But the tradition, based on the chronology of the surrounding chapters, has calculated it, and the number that emerges is 33. The son of the covenant, the promised child, the one whom death should have taken on the mountain, but was spared by a ram caught in a thicket, was 33 at the moment his life was laid on the altar. And he was spared. The ram died in his place. Now, I want to be honest with you about the nature of that calculation. It's a tradition, not a direct statement of the text, and scholars who work in this material debate the numbers, as scholars should. But the tradition is old. It predates Christianity. And the connection the early Christians drew between the binding of Isaac and the crucifixion of Jesus wasn't an invention of later theology. Paul draws it. The author of Hebrews draws it explicitly in chapter 11, where it says, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death, the sacrificial son, the promised son, the one who carried the wood up the mountain on his own back, the one who asked his father where the lamb was and was told God himself would provide. That figure was already in the tradition before Jesus was born. And when Jesus carried his own cross up to the hill outside Jerusalem, the Jewish readers of that story knew exactly what they were looking at. So you have David at 33 in Jerusalem, and you have the tradition of Isaac at 33 on the mountain, and you have Jesus at 33 on the hill outside Jerusalem. And the question that should be sitting in your mind right now is this design or is this coincidence? And I think the honest answer is that it depends on what you mean by design. If you mean someone sat down with a plan and engineered these biographical facts to hit a specific number, then no, that's not what this is. What it is something that the biblical tradition itself invites you to see. A pattern of divine action that plays out across different human lives in ways that rhyme. The same God who provided a ram on a mountain, who raised David from obscurity to reign in the holy city, who turned the death of the Passover lamb into the liberation of a people, that same God works with recurring patterns. Not because the patterns are magic, but because the patterns are the signature. And here's the thing that hits me every time I come back to this. The number 33 doesn't just mark the end of something. It marks the fulcrum. David's 33 years in Jerusalem were the years when the kingdom reached its greatest stability, when the preparations for the temple began, when the covenant dynasty was established that would run all the way to the exile and beyond. The binding of Isaac was the moment when the covenant was confirmed in the most costly possible way, and the ram in the thicket meant that the promise would continue, that the line would not be cut off. And the death of Jesus at 33 was, for those who understood it, not an ending, but a turning point. The moment the sacrifice was complete and the resurrection was 3 days away. Always 3 days. There's that 3 again, written into the very fabric of the story. Let me slow down here and look at something in the gospel accounts that tends to get rushed past. The night before the crucifixion, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's late. The disciples keep falling asleep. And 3 times, the text tells us, he went away and prayed. And 3 times, he came back and found them sleeping. And the prayer was the same each time. Not my will, but yours. 3 times. In the Hebrew pattern of witness and confirmation, 3 testimonies establish a truth. Jesus prayed that prayer 3 times in a garden at night, and 3 times the answer was the same silence that meant, this is the path to the cross. And then, a few hours later, in the courtyard of the high priest, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. 3 times the rooster crows. 3 times the beloved disciple looks away and says, I don't know him. And after the resurrection, On the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" 3 times. The restoration answering the denial, grace covering the exact shape of the wound, 3 and 3 and 3, sewn into the fabric of the story, with a precision that doesn't feel accidental. And Jesus was 30 years old when it all started. 3 years. 33 at the end. I want to take you into the Gospel of Luke for a moment, because Luke is the one who gives us the explicit age, and Luke is also the one who does something strange and deliberate with his genealogy that Matthew doesn't do. Matthew traces the line from Abraham forward to Jesus, which makes sense for a Jewish audience being shown that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. But Luke traces the line backward, from Jesus all the way to Adam, all the way to what he calls the Son of God. And he does it in a genealogy that, when you count the names, gives you 77 generations from Adam to Jesus. 77. 7 times 11. And the name that sits exactly at the midpoint of that genealogy, the pivot name, is David. David sits at generation 38 from Jesus and generation 39 from Adam, roughly at the center. And right around him in the count, the scholars have noted the presence of the name Mattatha, which echoes the Hebrew matana, meaning gift. The genealogy is constructed with an intentionality that Luke, a careful writer and historian by ancient standards, clearly put there for readers who could count. He's telling you something about the structure of history. He's telling you that Jesus doesn't arrive randomly. He arrives at the appointed time, in the appointed lineage, at the appointed age, fulfilling a pattern that was being laid down since the first human breath. The phrase "the appointed time" is worth sitting with in its Greek form. The word is kairos, and it's different from chronos, which is simple sequential time, the minutes ticking forward. Kairos is the charged moment, the moment of ripeness, the moment when what has been moving beneath the surface finally breaks through. Paul uses it in Galatians 4 verse 4 in one of the most compressed sentences in the whole New Testament. When the fullness of the time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. The fullness of the time. In Greek, the pleroma to chrono, the filling up of time, the moment when the measuring cup is finally full. And that moment landed at 33. Why then? Why not earlier? Why not later? It's a real question, and the tradition has offered several answers, and I want to give you the ones that seem most grounded. The first is the one we've already touched. 30 was the age of formal entry into Levitical service, and Jesus' ministry beginning at 30 fits the pattern of a priest entering his duties. But Jesus was not from the tribe of Levi. He was from Judah, from David's line, and the Levitical age of service doesn't apply to him directly. What it does is establish the parallel, the echo, the way this man who walked into the Jordan and came up dripping and was identified by a voice from heaven was stepping into a role that the whole sacrificial system of Israel had been pointing toward. He begins at the age when a priest begins, and he ends 3 years later, at 33, when the sacrifice is complete. The second answer has to do with what 33 represents in the ancient understanding of a full human life. This one is less often talked about in the modern church, but was taken seriously by early Christian writers. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the 2nd century, made the argument that Jesus had to live through every stage of human life in order to sanctify and redeem every stage. He had to be an infant to redeem infancy. He had to be a child to redeem childhood. He had to be a young man, and then a mature man, and only then could his death be the death of someone who had fully inhabited humanity in all its phases. Irenaeus actually argued that Jesus lived into old age, which most modern scholars don't accept. But the underlying point is serious. The incarnation was not a cameo. It was a full descent into human experience. And 33, in the ancient world, was a man in the full strength of maturity, neither the raw energy of youth nor the decline of old age, but the peak of human capacity, the moment when someone has lived enough to understand deeply and still has the strength to act on that understanding. The sacrifice at that moment was the sacrifice of the full flower of human life, not a child, not an old man, but a man at the height of what it means to be alive. The third answer is the one that I find the most quietly stunning, and it comes from a place most people don't look: the calendar. Specifically, the Hebrew calendar and the way the feast days were constructed. The Feast of Passover, Pesach in Hebrew, was not just a commemoration. It was a reenactment. Every year, the lamb was chosen on the 10th of Nisan, set aside for 4 days, and slaughtered on the 14th as the sun went down. The blood on the doorposts, the haste of the departure, the exodus set in motion, and in the tradition, the lamb had to be perfect, unblemished. Not because perfection was expected to be easy, but because what was being offered had to represent the full value of what was being asked: freedom, life, the deliverance of a people. When Jesus rode into Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday, the Gospels place it on the 10th of Nisan. He was observed, questioned, tested, challenged in the temple courts for 4 days. And on the 14th, as the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple, he was on the cross. The timing is exact. The liturgical calendar of Israel landed precisely on a 33-year-old man from Nazareth, and the precision of that landing is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of religion, or it is the fullness of the time arriving at last, the kairos breaking through the chronos. I want to stay in the temple for a moment, because the temple matters enormously for understanding what 33 means in this story. John chapter 2 has Jesus walking into the temple courts and driving out the money changers, and when the authorities challenge him and ask what sign he can show them for doing this, he says something that confused everyone who heard it: "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." 3 days. Again. And John adds the note, writing after the resurrection, that he was speaking about the temple of his body. The body as temple. The death of the body as the destruction of the temple. The resurrection as the rebuilding in 3 days. Now here's what most people don't know about that exchange. The authorities answer him by saying the temple has been under construction for 46 years. 46 years. That's the temple Herod began expanding around 20 BCE, the great renovation that was still ongoing during Jesus' lifetime. And Jesus' response, this body, is set against that number. 46 years of stone and labor and gold and human striving. 3 days of divine action. The contrast is part of the meaning, and it puts us back at the age of the body being offered. 33 years of embodied human life, then 3 days of death, then the morning that changed everything. There's a thread here I haven't pulled yet, and it runs through the Psalms in a way that rewards attention. Psalm 33 specifically, and I want to be honest, that the chapter numbering in Psalms is a much later addition, and the ancient readers didn't think of the Psalms by number the way we do. But Psalm 33 is worth reading in full and sitting with alongside this conversation, because what it describes is a God who speaks and things come into being, who watches over those who fear him, who holds the plans of nations and individuals alike, in whose hand is the steadfast love that holds the world together. The Hebrew word for steadfast love is chesed, and it's one of the richest words in the entire Old Testament, translated sometimes as loving kindness, sometimes as mercy, sometimes as covenant faithfulness. Chesed is the love that doesn't let go, the love that followed David even through his worst years, the love that stayed with the people through exile, The love that the tradition says became flesh and walked among us. Psalm 33 is, in a quiet way, a meditation on what kind of God could be trusted with a death at 33. The answer the psalm gives is one who speaks, and it is done. One who acts in history. One whose cassette endures. Let me take you now to something in the way Paul talks about the death of Jesus, because Paul, writing within 20 years of the crucifixion, while eyewitnesses were still alive and could contradict him, frames the whole thing in a way that connects directly to the question of age and timing and purpose. In Romans chapter 5, verse 8, Paul writes, God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners. Not when we'd cleaned ourselves up. Not when we'd earned it. Not when we'd made ourselves deserving. The timing of the death was not waiting for the world to get better. It was coming into the world as it was, and the age at which it happened carries something of that same logic. 33 is not an age of arrival or accomplishment in the worldly sense. David at 33 was still a young king. A man of 33 in the ancient world had lived his full young life, but had not yet accumulated the wealth or power or reputation that would make his loss feel convenient or abstract. He was, in the most immediate human sense, in the middle of things, which is exactly where grace tends to land. I think about what 33 looks like from the inside, and I mean this purely in terms of human experience, not in any way that reduces the figure of Jesus to merely human. At 33, a person has lived through childhood and adolescence and early adulthood. They've accumulated enough memory to understand regret. They've loved people and lost them, and wondered what it means that love and loss come so close together. They've begun to see the shape of their own limits, and they still believe that something is possible. There's a particular kind of sorrow and a particular kind of hope that belong to that specific age, and the tradition has always understood, though it rarely says so plainly, that Jesus' death at that age was the death of someone who understood human experience from the inside. Not the death of an old man ready to go, not the tragic death of a child cut off before understanding, but the death of someone at the fullness of human consciousness, who chose the path with open eyes. The letter to the Hebrews, one of the most theologically dense documents in the New Testament, and one whose author is still debated by scholars, makes the point in its own way when it says in chapter 4, verse 15, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. Yet he did not sin. A high priest who can empathize, who was tested in every way." That's a claim about experience, about what 33 years in a human body in first-century Judea actually produced in terms of lived knowledge. Hunger and thirst, betrayal and loneliness, grief at the tomb of a friend, the exhaustion of crowds pressing in on every side, the weight of knowing what was coming. 33 years of that, and then the willingness to walk into the garden at night, knowing that the prayer wouldn't change the path. Now I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier and haven't fully unpacked: the connection between 33 and the concept of completion or fullness in the Hebrew understanding of numbers. The number 30 in the Hebrew tradition was associated with mourning. This is not well known outside the scholarship. But when Aaron died in the wilderness, Numbers chapter 20, verse 29, the people mourned for 30 days. When Moses died, Deuteronomy 34, they mourned for 30 days. 30 days of mourning, followed on the 31st day by the necessity of moving on, of carrying the covenant forward without the one who led it. And so 30 was the number held at the edge between the old and the new, between what was and what was coming. Jesus began his ministry at 30. He stood at the edge of the old and was about to begin the new. 3 years later, at 33, the morning would begin for the disciples, and it would last, in a sense, precisely 3 days before the movement forward that no one could have predicted or imagined. And 3 is the number that splits 30 into 33, 3 years of ministry, 3 days in the tomb, 3 times the prayer in Gethsemane, 3 times Peter's denial, 3 times the question on the shore, 3 Passovers, 3 hours of darkness on the cross, according to Matthew chapter 27. From the 6th hour to the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land. 3 hours of darkness at midday, the sign in the sky that something was happening that the sky itself couldn't look at. And then the cry of desolation, and then the silence, and then the last breath, and then the soldier's spear, and then the tomb. Let me tell you what happens in the Jewish tradition on the 3rd day after a death. There is an ancient belief, preserved in the Talmud and rooted in a reading of Hosea chapter 6, that the soul hovers near the body for 3 days before finally departing. Hosea 6:2 says, "After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will restore us, that we may live in his presence." The early Christian readers of this text, and there were many Jewish Christians who knew Hosea well, understood what 3 days meant. It meant the soul had not yet left. It meant something could still happen. It meant the story wasn't over until the 3rd day. And on the morning of the 3rd day, according to every account we have, something happened that no one had a framework for. The stone was moved, the wrappings were left behind, and a man who had been dead stood in a garden and was at first, in the most human detail in all of Scripture, mistaken for the gardener. A gardener in a garden. The very last scene of the Hebrew Bible's creation story is set in a garden where a man and a woman are expelled, and the way back is barred. The very first scene of the new creation, as the early Christian writers understood it, is set in a garden where a man who has come back from death is mistaken for the one who tends the earth. The first Adam in the first garden, reaching for something he was not supposed to have and losing everything. The second Adam, as Paul calls him, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in the second garden, returning from the only place that should have been the end of everything, and offering instead a new beginning. And the man in the second garden, the one who walked out of the tomb, was 33 years old, 3 years of ministry, and now 3 days of death. And now the morning that arrives with the sound of a woman crying and a name spoken in the dark. Mary. There are scholars who have noticed, and I think this observation is worth taking seriously, even though it comes from the intersection of theology and literary analysis, that the structure of the Gospel of John in particular seems to be consciously built around a week at the end of Jesus' life that mirrors the week of creation in Genesis. The creation week begins with darkness and void and ends with rest. The Passion Week begins with the triumphal entry and ends with the silence of the tomb on the Sabbath. And then, on the first day of the new week, the day after the Sabbath, the day that the early church would come to call the Lord's Day, the resurrection. The new creation beginning at the exact moment the old week of rest was over. The new Adam stepping out of the new garden into a new week that had no end written into it. And all of it happening at the age of 33. Not as a magical number, not as a number that carries power in itself, but as the coordinate where these arcs converged. The arc of a human life, the arc of the covenant, the arc of the calendar, the arc of the Hebrew understanding of time and morning and completion. I want to slow down here and think with you about what it means that we can even ask this question. The question of why 33. The question presupposes that the death of Jesus was not random, not accidental, not a tragedy that caught everyone off guard, but an event that was woven into a larger story. And that's a presupposition worth examining, because there are people who hear that and find it cold, the idea that this was planned, that a man's suffering was somehow part of a design. I understand that. It's not a small thing to sit with. But the tradition has always held, and I think this is worth saying plainly, that the design was not external to the person. Jesus in Gethsemane was not a pawn moved by divine machinery. The Gospels are very clear. He chose. 3 times he prayed for another way, and 3 times he accepted the path that was before him. The design and the freedom coexist in that garden, and they coexist in the number 33, because the number is not the cage. The number is the signature of a God who works in history through real choices made by real people, and whose patterns reveal that what looks like chaos from the inside of a single human life is being held together by something that can see from further back. David at 33 in Jerusalem was a man who had sinned catastrophically, who had arranged the death of one of his most loyal soldiers to cover his own adultery, who had broken the covenant he claimed to represent, and who had still been held by a God who would not let him go. The Psalms are full of that holding. Psalm 51, the one David writes after Nathan the prophet confronts him, is one of the most honest prayers of repentance ever written. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence. The man who reigned 33 years in Jerusalem wrote that prayer. He knew what it cost to fail and what it cost to come back. And the tradition that sees his 33 years as a type of the 33 years of Jesus is not saying the 2 men were the same. It's saying the same God who held David in his failure and restored him to his throne was at work again in a far deeper way, in the death and resurrection of someone in the same city, on the same hill that Genesis chapter 22 calls the mountain of the Lord, the same hill where Abraham looked up and saw a ram and called the place Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide. Abraham named the mountain that. He named it in the future tense, as if the provision wasn't only for that day, but for some later day he couldn't fully see. And the rabbinic tradition preserved that future tense, kept it alive across centuries. And when the early Christian writers came to that phrase and looked at what had happened on the hill outside Jerusalem, they recognized what Abraham had named and what he had not yet seen. The Lord had provided. Not a ram this time, but the covenant fulfilled at last, at the age of 33, in the city David had held for 33 years, on the mountain that had been waiting since the patriarch named it, in the language of an unfinished promise. Let me tell you something about what happens to the number after the resurrection, because I think this is where a lot of people stop looking, and it's exactly where the story gets interesting. In Acts chapter 1, Luke tells us that Jesus appeared to his disciples over a period of 40 days after the resurrection. 40 days. There's that number of testing and completion again. 40 days in the wilderness before his ministry. 40 days after his death before his ascension. And in those 40 days, according to the same chapter, he spoke to them about the kingdom of God. Not a triumphant proclamation. Not a new political program. Just a continuing conversation about the same thing he'd been talking about for 3 years. The kingdom. And then he was gone, and 10 days later, on the Feast of Shavuot, which in the Greek tradition is called Pentecost, the Spirit came like wind and fire and filled the room, and what had been a small group of frightened people became something the ancient world had never seen, not because they had a new idea, but because the same Spirit that had hovered over the waters in Genesis 1, the The same Ruach Elohim, the breath or wind of God, had come to stay. And here's the detail that holds me. The disciples who were gathered in that room on the day of Pentecost were, according to Acts, about 120 people. 120. In the Hebrew numerical tradition, 120 is 30 times 4, which is the number of a completed generation. Moses lived 120 years. His life was 3 periods of 40. 40 years as an Egyptian prince, 40 years as a shepherd in Midian, 40 years as the leader of the Exodus. 3 40s. And now, the movement that began with the death of a 33-year-old in Jerusalem was born into the world through a gathering of 120 people. The numbers of the Old Covenant, written into the bones of the new beginning. The tradition never stops referencing the tradition. The new always arrives wearing the clothing of the old, because that's how you know it's from the same source. I've been thinking about this for a long time now, and I want to tell you honestly what I find most arresting about the number 33 in the context of everything we've walked through. It's not that the number is magic. It's not that there's some code hidden in the text that unlocks a secret. What arrests me is the sheer patience of it. The patience of a story that laid down a pattern with Abraham on a mountain and kept that pattern alive through David's kingship and through the calendar of the feasts and through the prayers of the Psalms and through the genealogy that Luke traces backward to the first breath of the first human. And then, at the appointed time, at the fullness of the time, placed a man at the intersection of all of it. 30 years old at the beginning, 33 at the end, 3 years in between that contain more density of meaning than most centuries. The patience of that is staggering to me. The long preparation, the accumulation of types and shadows and promises, and then the arrival. There's a phrase in the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 26, that I want to read carefully with you, because it contains something I think we often rush past. It says, "Now he has appeared once for all, at the culmination of the ages, to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself." The culmination of the ages. In Greek, the syntelia ton ionon, the end gathering of the ages, the moment when all the ages converge. Not the end of time, not the last day, but the moment of convergence, the moment when what has been moving through all the previous eras comes to a point. And that point was the cross, at 33, when the Passover lamb was slain, and the darkness covered the land for 3 hours, and the curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom, and the old order of access to God through sacrifice was at once completed and superseded. Completed, because the sacrifice was finally perfect and final. Superseded, because after a perfect and final sacrifice, the old system had nothing left to do. The curtain was torn, because the room it was guarding was no longer sealed. Do you see what's happening in that image? The torn curtain. The Holy of Holies, the innermost room of the temple, the one place where the presence of God was understood to dwell in the most concentrated way, the room that only the high priest could enter once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, with blood and incense and trembling. That room was suddenly accessible. The veil that separated it, a massive thing by all ancient accounts, thick as a man's hand, woven with blue and purple and crimson, embroidered with cherubim, was torn. From top to bottom, the Gospels say, which means it was torn from above, not from below, not human hands. And the moment it was torn was the moment the man on the cross breathed his last. The same moment. The sacrifice and the access given at the same instant, the 33 years and the 3 hours of darkness and the final cry, and then the curtain. It's one movement. I find myself sitting with the detail of the embroidered cherubim on that curtain, because the last thing embroidered with cherubim we encounter in the Hebrew scriptures before the temple is the entrance to the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3, where God places the cherubim to guard the way to the tree of life. The garden closed, the cherubim on guard, the tree of life sealed off. And now, at the moment, a 33-year-old man dies on a hill that the tradition identifies with the same mountain range where Abraham was told by God himself to go. The cherubim on the curtain are torn. The guard is taken away. The tree of life is no longer sealed. And the man who dies there, in the Gospel of John, is buried in a garden. And 3 days later, a woman who knew him well mistakes him for the gardener. The garden opened, the cherubim at rest, the tree of life available again. From Genesis 3 to John 20, the story of the closed garden and the guarded tree is the story. And it closes, or rather, it opens, at 33. I want to be careful not to wrap this too neatly, because the point isn't neatness. The point is the kind of depth that remains after the wrapping is done, the kind that keeps you going back. So let me say this clearly. The number 33 does not explain the death of Jesus. Nothing so simple as a number explains it. What it does is point you toward the texture of the story, the way the biblical narrative was woven with patterns that stretch across centuries and keep returning in new forms. It points you toward the patience of the God who laid those patterns down. It points you toward the seriousness of a story that was not improvised, not reactive, not a rescue operation for a plan that had gone wrong. It was a culmination. The ages gathering, the promises converging, the calendar landing exactly where it was meant to land, on the 14th of Nisan, on a Friday afternoon, in the year that scholars still debate, but that the astronomical record supports, somewhere around 30 or 33 CE, when a man from Nazareth, who was 33 years old, said it is finished and breathed his last. The word he used, in the Greek of John's account, is tetelestai. It's a single word in Greek, and it's in the perfect tense, which in Greek grammar means an action that has been completed with results that continue. Not it was finished, as if the thing were simply over, but it is finished and remains finished, the state of completion ongoing, the work done, and the doing of it permanent. Accountants in the ancient world used the same word on paid invoices. The debt is satisfied, the record is clear, the account is closed. Tetelestai. One word, spoken by a man at 33 on the day the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple just across the valley, in a city where David had reigned 33 years, on a mountain that Abraham had named the Lord will provide, in the fullness of the time, at the culmination of the ages. And the perfect tense means it's still true. Whatever was finished then is still finished now. The state of completion that entered the world on that afternoon has not been undone. Tetelestai. It is finished, and it remains so. There's a question underneath all of this that I think is the real one, the one that brings most people to this material, even if they don't name it as a question. And the question is something like, does any of this matter to me today, in the life I'm actually living? And I want to answer it honestly, which means I can't answer it for you. I can only tell you what I find when I sit with it. What I find is that the number 33, when you understand what it's pointing to, is not primarily a historical curiosity. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to see your own life as lived inside a story that has more patience and more depth than you can currently measure. The same God who laid down patterns across 1,000 years of Hebrew scripture, who held David through his catastrophic failure and brought him back to Jerusalem, who heard Abraham name a mountain in the future tense and kept that future tense alive for centuries, who placed a man at the convergence of every promise that had been building since the first garden. That same God is, the tradition insists, at work in the particular shape of your particular life. The 33 is not a number for admiring from a distance. It's a number that says, the patience that wove this story is the same patience that holds yours. And if you're sitting with something unfinished in yourself, some failure that you've kept longer than you meant to, some version of the prayer David prayed in Psalm 51, some part of yourself you've handed over to the darkness in a garden at night, the tradition that runs through all of this has something specific to say about it. The arc that ended at 33 doesn't end there. It passes through the torn curtain and into a room that was previously sealed, the innermost room, the place where the presence was, the place you weren't allowed to go before. And the torn curtain is not a symbol of destruction. It's a door. The cherubim are not on guard anymore. The tree of life is not sealed off anymore. And whatever is finished in the perfect tense, which means the finishing of it is still present, still active, still available, still reaching toward the particular life you're carrying today in whatever city you're in, however far that city is from a hill outside Jerusalem. The morning the tomb was found empty, the disciples didn't understand it yet. That's worth saying, because there's a version of this story that makes the resurrection sound obvious in retrospect, as if anyone paying attention should have seen it coming. But they didn't. The women came to the tomb with spices to anoint a dead body. They weren't expecting an empty grave. They were expecting grief. And the first emotion the Gospels record is not joy. It's bewilderment. Fear. Mary weeping in the garden and mistaking the living for the dead. The understanding came later. It came slowly. It came through the breaking of bread in a house in Emmaus, through the appearance in the locked room, through the question on the lake shore, through the 40 days of continued conversation. Understanding doesn't come all at once. The meaning of 33 didn't come all at once for those who were there. It came as they went back through everything they had known about Abraham and David, and the Psalms and the Passover, and saw it all lit from behind by what had happened. The way a lamp placed behind a piece of parchment reveals the watermark that was always there but invisible in ordinary light. That's what I hope this has been for you, if even a little. Not a lecture, not a proof, but a lamp placed behind something you've maybe seen your whole life without fully seeing. The number 33, the age of David's reign in Jerusalem, the age of the traditions Isaac on the mountain, the age of the man who said tetelestai in the perfect tense on a Friday afternoon at Passover, the age at which the culmination of the ages arrived in the body of one person at the intersection of every promise the Hebrew scriptures had been keeping. And then the third day. Always the third day. And then the morning. And then the garden. And then the name spoken in the dark. And the recognition. And the beginning of everything that came after. The Lord will provide. Abraham named the mountain that and went home, not knowing how fully he had spoken. We read it now from the other side of the 33, and the future tense of the name has finally become the present. The provision was made. Tetelestai. It is finished, and the finishing of it is still here, still present, still reaching, still enough.